My name's Rob Gay. I'm owner of Viewpoint Ag Valuation and Consulting. I operate out of the northeast corner of New York State, covering upstate New York, throughout Vermont and portions of New Hampshire, really throughout the Maple Belt. And let's go to the background. Certified general real estate appraiser in New York, Vermont, New Hampshire. I run a small independent firm serving banks, individuals, government entities, law firms. We do real estate, personal property, and I've branched out into some business valuation, seen that some small businesses are building retail markets or profitable markets that might bring extra value above asset value. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the presentation. I specialize in agriculture and related processing, and maple is near and dear to my heart as I produce syrup on 7,500 taps in upstate New York. What's this, auto? And with my brother and some other family involved. The presentation today is to gain familiarity with common appraisal and valuation terms, methodologies, discuss standards of valuation for different users and uses, talk about factors that drive Sugarbush values and rural property values in general, application of market data to guide asset valuation, and some considerations for maple financing. I've been in the financing world for about 10 years and really watched the maple industry grow significantly over that period of time, and have a few thoughts on that I'll share. The first part of the presentation here, I want to make sure we're all on the same page, speaking the same language. So we're going to go through some sort of technical appraisal terms, talk about common types of value and different ways of looking at value for real estate and equipment. But we're going to move kind of quickly through that because I think we're really here to talk about maple valuation specifically, and I want to make sure we get to the meat of the content here. So the common types of value you'll see out there, the tax value would be the assessment based on, everyone knows what the assessment is. Insurance value, you might see that with your insurance company. They're going to put a value on your structures. Book value would be a cost-based valuation that's used in taxes with IRS-derived depreciation. Investment value is something that would be specific to an individual or business. You might analyze a potential purchase to find out what would I pay for it, given its contribution to my individual business. And then you've got business value, which is the total assets of the business as a going concern. What we're going to focus a lot on now is market value, though, and this is something that you're going to see most often in financing or in a sales situation. And what you're looking for is the most competitive price that a property would bring in a competitive and open market. So we're going to focus a lot on market value because that's a lot of what I do, and we'll move through some of this other stuff fairly quickly. So let's make a distinction between an appraisal and an assessment. An appraisal is an estimate of market value of something. We're going to determine the market value using the data obtained from the marketplace, whereas an assessment is really a value calculated by the assessor used to determine the amount of taxes to be paid. They're typically going to use a formula to come up with that value, and it may or may not be based on market data. Insurance value, you're going to see two things here: replacement cost and actual cash value. Replacement cost would be the full cost to rebuild or replace the asset. This would not include any depreciation, so you'd get paid out for the full replacement cost in the event of a covered loss, whereas the actual cash value is minus depreciation. Now, this isn't really market-derived depreciation. This is determined by the insurance company. Book value would be accounting value based on cost minus IRS depreciation. IRS depreciation definitely does not track market depreciation. It's something that is applied by your accountant. One thing to note here is that may include installation costs and amortization costs that might not be recognized in a market value analysis, depending on the situation. Investment value is something you'll see as folks try to analyze a potential purchase. It's the value to an individual or business based upon considerations that are unique to that investor. So a good example would be if you were buying an abutting piece of Sugarbush that was behind you and was right-of-way access. In the market, it may not have the same value that it would have to your business because you're able to bring that into your sugar house and the access doesn't matter so much to you. On the open market, it may have a significantly different value than your investment value calculation. And then there's the going concern value. Here's something that I think a lot of people maybe haven't dealt with a lot. Business value or going concern is the real estate value plus the personal property plus the intangible assets. So it's all the assets that are creating the income. And the way that we come to a business value or going concern value is we analyze the income stream in comparison with sales of businesses within that industry or in similar industries. Now, bulk syrup sap producers generally don't have intangible asset value. Generally, the value of their business is the value of the assets. That's commonly commodity agriculture producers in the U.S. don't generally have intangible asset value. Where we see going concern value is when you've developed retail markets or wholesale markets that pay above the bulk price, and that may have value based on the increased income that this creates. So sales in more profitable channels generally bring additional value. I would urge you to consider these things as two separate but related businesses. You've got the production of the maple syrup in bulk, putting it in 40 or 55-gallon drums, versus the sale of syrup in smaller containers. A lot of times we'll see that the production and sales businesses are integrated. I urge folks to keep records to analyze them separately. That way you can prove the degree of increased income over the bulk markets. I think it's fairly easy to do that in a lot of cases. You can take the bulk price and, let's say, move at $2.25 a pound, move it from a 40-gallon drum into the other business. And at that point, you've got the bulk price, and anything above that would go to the retail business. Overlapping assets can be allocated between the two businesses. So, you might be bottling in the sugar house. You might be using the filter press, a preheater and a filter press. You might be using a delivery truck, the same labor force. That kind of thing can be addressed in an allocation of those assets. So we're going to focus on market value. I want to define it, make sure everyone understands exactly what that is, as opposed to these other types of value we've talked about. And a lot of the presentation is going to focus on market value because what we do is look at market data to determine those values. So a lot of times this is used for collateral purposes to determine asset value. We do it to inform sellers for marketing of assets or for asset transfer within a family or within a business. And it reflects market-based appreciation in typical market behavior. I think that's key. Get into the weeds a little bit here. In a market value situation, we're looking at the buyer and seller being typically motivated, well-informed, acting in their own best interest. The property needs to have reasonable time allowed for exposure in the open market. Now, the appraisal is going to talk about what is a reasonable time and what is reasonable market exposure. I think those are important things to understand. A lot of times I won't say throw out sales, but we may not weight sales quite so heavily if they weren't as well marketed as they could have been, because it may not reflect how the market reacts. Payment, the other two are sort of more intuitive, payment in US dollars and unaffected by special or creative financing or concessions. I'm going to move fairly quickly through this. This is here for, you guys will have access to this slideshow later on, so you can run through this stuff if parts of an appraisal are not familiar to you. But I want to run through at a fairly high level what you're going to see in an appraisal. You're going to have identification of why we're doing it, who's going to use it, the date of the inspection or the effective date. We're often the same. In the report date, we're going to describe the property, describe the scope of work, what did we do, what did we not do, explain the methods used in the appraisal, and importantly, which ones we did not use, and summary of analysis, rationale, and conclusions. Where'd that go? All right. So these, I think, are important to pay attention to, something that a lot of folks sort of gloss over because they're not familiar with it. Look closely at an appraisal and make sure you understand the extraordinary assumptions. Something that we don't know if it's true, but we're assuming it is. So let's say you haven't done a tap count yet. You think there's 5,000 taps out there. but we're not exactly sure because we don't have a professional opinion. We may have an extraordinary assumption in the appraisal that there's 5,000 maple taps in there. That really drives value in this market. And if there was 3,000, the value could be significantly different. Hypothetical conditions are something that we know is not true, and we're going to appraise it as if it is. Here, a great example of that is you're going to be building a sugar house on this property. You've asked me to appraise the property as if the sugar house already exists. What's the property going to be worth once the sugar house is there? That would be a hypothetical condition. Sugar house is not there yet, but it will be. Highest and best use is a really important thing to understand in the appraisal. Generally, on commercial Sugarbush appraisals, the highest and best use is maple. And that's often in the more rural locations of the region. That is the highest and best use of parcels with a high concentration of maple and all the things that make it feasible to develop for maple operations. But it can be something different. Like if you were close to a developed area, it may have other highest and best use that need to be considered. And the current use of the property is not necessarily the highest and best use. What we're looking for is what's the most profitable use, what's the highest value that this property would bring, given the legal, physical, and economic limitations of the property in the current market. Three commonly recognized approaches to value that you're going to see in an appraisal: sales comparison, cost, and income approach. They're all intended to reflect buyer sentiment and market behavior. They all rely on market data and analysis of sales data. But they approach it a little bit differently. We'll kind of go into that in a few minutes. An appraisal can include one, two, or all three approaches. Just because an approach was left out doesn't necessarily mean that an error was made or that someone didn't do a good job. These approaches are developed and they should be reflective of analyses performed by market participants. A lot of times folks are not considering a certain approach applicable in a given situation, and the appraiser should be reflecting that in their work. Sales comparison approach takes recent sales of similar properties and makes a comparison to the subject property, the property we're appraising. We're going to make adjustments to the sale price for differences that we can recognize between the subject and the sales. Obviously, a sale of real estate is fairly unique, and we're going to make some adjustments to try to bring them into, equalize them with the subject. We're going to rely on trend analysis, match paired sales, discussions with sellers and buyers. Everything should be based in the market. The cost approach is generally used for properties with buildings or for newer equipment, and it's considered most reliable for valuation of assets with limited reliable sales data. I'm thinking these newer maple operations with 100,000 taps, there's not going to be sales of these things at this point. Really, these things have developed in the past 5 to 8 years. We have a reasonable idea of what the cost to build out is, but we don't have sales to really put our finger on what is the value per tap or the value per acre of these things. So I think the cost approach is really valuable in that situation where you can extract depreciation data from the market using sales of smaller operations, sales of pieces of equipment, and apply that to larger operations and come to a well-supported value despite the lack of sales information that's directly applicable to the appraisal problem. And it's based upon the premise that an informed buyer won't pay more for existing structures or equipment than the cost of constructing or buying a reasonable substitute. I think that's pretty logical. There's no reason that one would pay more than the cost to buy something of similar utility. So the way that this works, the mechanics of it, we'll determine for real estate, we'll determine land value, we'll add in the value of the site improvements, and then for the buildings, we'll use replacement cost minus depreciation. So it's the cost to build subtracted by physical, functional, and economic depreciation. Let's go into that at a high level. How do we determine cost new? We're going to use cost guides, comparable projects in the market area, buyer expectations. Our job really is to talk to people and find out what they're thinking. From there, once we have a reliable cost new, we're going to depreciate that using physical depreciation. This is not the same thing as tax depreciation. Determining an economic life is different than determining than looking at an asset life as determined by the IRS. I'm sure the IRS has rationale for what they're doing, but it doesn't necessarily track the market. Functional depreciation is things that are unique characteristics of the property that might impact value. Some folks will overbuild, for instance, and the market may not recognize that the value in that particular part of the improvement because of really specialized portions of the building. Economic depreciation, we call it in the banking world lost capital. It's buyers pay less than cost most often due to changing standards and economic conditions. I think the best example of this is that we all know about is the idea that when you drive the car off the lot, you couldn't turn around and sell it for exactly what you bought it for. That's pretty common, and it does apply in real estate too. A few more things on determining cost new. I get questions about these actual things. So are we going to use actual owner cost or typical market cost? I think it depends on what you're doing. For market value, we are going to use market-based cost data. We want to reflect costs that would be typical in the market. A lot of times folks are doing a lot of the building themselves, losing a lot of their own labor. They're using lumber off the farm versus purchased materials. They're getting equipment at significant discounts because they know the dealer. In appraisal, we're really trying to reflect what is the most common thing in the marketplace, and what would it cost to build something if you were hiring most of this stuff out, because that is really reflective of what the market's doing. Installation costs, I think, are a big one here. Do we include those? For some items, in some cases, yes. In other cases, it may not be appropriate. If you're looking for a going concern value, where you're going to sell the piece of property, you're going to sell the business lock, stock, and barrel, installation costs are probably applicable and probably should be included in that analysis. If you're looking for a collateral value for the bank, you may not include those installation costs because they may be looking for the value of the personal property if it was removed from that sugar house and sold on the open market. So those could be two very different things. We're currently working on an UVM Maple investment profiles that's going to quantify some of these typical investment costs at different scales. That's not fully ready yet, but I expect in early 2021 we will release that. And that'll be additional guidance on cost new for build out of typical sized maple operations that we're seeing in our area. Now, the income approach is based on the principle of anticipation. So the today's value is indicated by the expectation of future income and benefits. It's really pretty simple. You're looking at the sales, you're estimating an income, you know what the sale price was, which gives you the rate. You're going to apply that rate to an estimated income for the subject to get to the value of the subject, solving for value. I think one really important thing to touch on here is the rental-based income approach versus an owner-operator income approach. When we're looking for real estate value, we really need to be looking, I think, at a rental-based income approach because it strips out all the management decisions and brings you to a real estate value versus a going concern value. An owner-operator income statement is specific to that owner-operator, specific to that management, and really gives you a going concern value. It is very legitimate to do it that way, but it doesn't necessarily give you a real estate value. I'm going to stop for a moment and see if there's any questions. Tom, is there anything in the chat box, or can I keep on rolling here?
Nothing in the chat box yet.
Okay, so we're to the meat of the presentation here, and we're going to talk about analysis of Sugarbush real estate first, and then we'll get into some information on equipment. We'll get to some information on pipeline. this is all really geared toward market value. So we're looking at sales of similar pieces of properties, similar operations, and trying to extract from the market useful data that we can apply to an appraisal problem to come up with values that are based in market information. So the primary considerations for Sugarbush real estate that I've seen are location, access, electrical communication service, density, ease of operation, forest health and site quality, and what I'll lump into other amenities. So first on location, this is a really cool map that shows you the members of the Vermont Sugar Makers Association by town. The bigger the dot, the more sugar makers in that location. Predictably, the Champlain Valley and up into the northern tier really are the most concentration throughout Chittenden, Lamoille, Franklin County. And I think it's important to understand when you're working in a certain location, what's the level of competition in the neighborhood for maple parcels? How far are you from other sap purchasers? What's the competition for purchased sap in the neighborhood? And the proximity to population centers or other higher value uses. I'll often look at rental rates as a valuable piece of information, which is a proxy for how much competition's in that market. Another interesting thing to look at is what percentage of the syrup price are sap buyers paying in that particular location. Generally, the higher the percentage, the more competition there is for the sap, and you're in a more competitive location. Access is probably one of the most important things that we look at in the valuation of Sugarbush real estate, or any real estate for that matter. Three primary categories are that I've lumped the properties into are those with road frontage, those located on a right-of-way, and those that are landlocked. Road frontage properties generally sell significantly higher than the other two. They've got some alternative uses generally. There might be building lots. This might be a good place to put a sugar house. And the extra utility that comes along with other long-term potential uses generally does bring additional value in the marketplace. Why is this doing that? Right-of-way properties are deeded right to cross another property. So this means that you have the right to cross someone else's property to access your property. You may or may not have the right to bring power in. A lot of times we see tanks set by the road in a right-of-way. It's really important to understand what your rights are in a right-of-way situation. It'll often spell that right out in the deed for you. Sometimes the handshake deal with the neighbor doesn't work out for the next buyer. So deeded rights are really important, and understanding exactly what those are before you get into purchasing a piece of property, I think is really important. Landlocked parcels in our area generally can be accessed for timber harvest, but you don't necessarily have the legal right to access the property on a regular basis. And obviously you will need to access the property pretty regularly during mud season to sugar it. We see a real diminution in value for landlocked parcels versus the other two. There's not a big market for a landlocked parcel for obvious reasons. The abutters are really the biggest market for these pieces. This slide used to say only electrical service. As folks have adopted technology in the sugar house and have adopted monitoring systems even at remote locations and remote collection sites, I'm looking more and more at what's the internet service at this piece of property. What speed do you have, and how far is it to electrical or internet service if it's not there? Kind of roughly group these into developed on site, it's at the road, it's at a distance. In these rural locations, it can be quite expensive to extend electrical and internet service up the side of a road on a right-of-way to a property that does not have it. It can be quite expensive. And so how far does it need to be extended? Are the easements in place? Can easements be obtained? Something to consider is, will you have to pay back another owner who's already extended it up a certain distance, and you may have to pay contribution in aid of construction. There's a certain period of time during which you will have to pay back someone that's already spent the money to bring power up where it previously was not. The next one on the list here is the density. It's pretty simple. Total potential taps divided by the acreage to be tapped. All else being equal, a property with higher density is going to be worth more than one with lower density. Now, that all else being equal, it's one of our big factors that we adjust for, but it's not the only one. Generally, what we see in the field is between 40 and 100 taps per acre is most typical. Most folks aren't going to tap woods under 40 taps per acre. And 100 taps per acre and above seems to be a little overstocked. High density probably has a limit. Optimal density allows for full crown development with proper spacing of the trees. I generally cap my adjustments for density below 100 taps per acre, knowing that many folks will start thinning before 100 taps per acre. Management differences can impact tap counts. So what's the minimum diameter you're going to be tapping? Which standards are you following? I think as the maple industry matures, we're seeing a lot more emphasis on forest management, and folks are following these tapping guidelines closer. Organic certification is pushing that. Vermont current use requirements are pushing that. Someone had a question on sign up about the impact of average DBH on valuing a sugar bush, and I think it's a good question. I don't specifically adjust for average DBH across the forest, but I think the density adjustment speaks something to that. So if your average size is 16 to 20 inches, generally you're going to be putting in 2 spouts. So we're going to be counting 2 taps in each of those trees. Now, whether you put 2 taps in it or not is up to you, but to standardize some of this information, when we look at tap counts, we're using these metrics to determine tap counts so that we're getting more consistency in our comparisons. I think that helps to equalize some of these issues with larger average DBH over a sugar bush. Ease of operation is what I call ease of operation encompasses a few different things, and it's a measure of operability of the parcel as related to a theoretical ideal sugar bush. So the ideal sugar bush would slope toward the access point, would all slope to one location, would not require any pump stations. It would be, that easy 3 to 8% slope with no big ravines that impact tubing layout. It would have internal roads that allow you to access the entire outside of the woods as well as the top of the woods, and there's no lines crossing these roads, and it has no underbrush and a fully closed canopy. I haven't seen it yet, but it's a theoretical ideal. And so I think it's a useful comparison tool to compare the ease of operation from one sugar bush to another to make some judgments about how easy is it going to be to set up pipeline? What kind of infrastructure costs are we going to see to build roads, to maintain the infrastructure over time? And really this speaks to the cost to build out the infrastructure as well as maintenance over a long period of time, which can really impact your cost of production over a long period of time, which logically is going to impact what you're willing to pay for that piece of property. Oops. Forest health and site quality is something that I've had trouble putting my finger on exactly. I take it into consideration, certainly, although it's been difficult for me to exactly figure out how to quantify this. We're looking at tree health overall, crown dieback, canopy closure, tap hole closure, visible logging damage to roots and stems. We're going to be looking at marketable timber. Does your management plan, often when you're in current use, you're required to have a management plan, but often larger parcels do have management plans. Does it call for a timber harvest soon? When is it scheduled to be harvested? What's scheduled to be harvested? Is it non-maple saw timber that's going to bring some real cash flow, or is it lower value wood products that'll be sort of a cost to get out of the woods? What's the management history, past management? What were the goals, and how has this impacted the resource? Were the logging jobs closed out properly, or do we see signs of erosion and road degradation that are going to be costly to fix? And then what's the overall site quality? We can use the site index as a guide. SAP production history can be a clue to site quality, although that can also be impacted by management decisions. A tool that's coming out in 2021, also developed by UVM, is a forest and site assessment resource. I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of that to try to quantify this factor a little better, because it is difficult to put your finger on, but it's extremely important in understanding the overall quality of the site for long-term productivity and tree health. Other amenities that we'll consider are whether there's water developed to the site, or if there is a spring on the land, spring on neighboring land. What's the wastewater disposal capacity? I am mapping properties to find out what their soils are and where the likely septic capacity is, permeable soils. Lease income, not directly related to maple leases, but are there other like wind leases, recreational leases, hunting leases, that might bring some value to the table. Will there be some harvest of non-maple to offset expenditure for maple improvements? And then other land types. Do we have some cropland there? Are there building lots? Or do we have some wetlands that need to be considered as non-productive acreage? So this kind of rounds out the factors that we're looking at for valuing the real estate. I'm going to jump into pipeline valuation unless anyone has a question on the real estate side. Okay, I'll take that as a no. So what is the useful life of pipeline? I'm personally using some 25-year-old pipeline that is difficult to operate. So it's possible to use pipeline for 25 plus years, but what's the realistic economic life? Is it 10, 15, 20 years? In my experience, the market data is indicating a degree of lost capital in the 10 to 20% range in an estimated 10-year economic life. Economic life is a measure of the length of time that an asset will remain useful to the average owner. This can be significantly different than the actual physical life. This conversation gets really interesting with different maple producers who have some strong opinions on how long they will be using their pipeline. So let's keep in mind that we're looking at an appraisal analysis here, I'm not necessarily making recommendations on management decisions. So here's my 25-year-old pipeline in the picture here. Some of these laterals have 10, 12 taps per lateral. This was common 20 years ago. It was a best practice, actually. You can see that the black water pipe, there's a 3/4 inch line. There's a fitting about halfway up. Does it work? Yes. Is it modern? No. Changing technology can make pipeline decline in value when it still has remaining physical life. In changes in best practices, a 10 to 15 year time period can make pipeline obsolete, even though it has remaining physical life. The differences in layout over the past 10, 15 years can make some nice looking pipeline obsolete. And I've seen producers tear out 10-year-old pipeline because it just isn't where it should be. The theory about how you lay out pipeline has changed a lot in the last 10 years, and that can impact the value of pipeline that's in the woods now. The production history may provide an indication of utility of the pipeline. Generally, poor layout will show up in the production records. It's really hard to get a half gallon of syrup out of poorly laid out pipeline. So I tell people maple pipeline as collateral, it's like used concrete. If it's in good shape and it's located right where you want it, it might have some value. Otherwise, it's just a cost to remove. The cost new averages around $15 a tap. That would include the wet dry line, the main lines, the laterals to the spout. That doesn't include any sap collection other than that. So you're not including the vacuum pump, the pump house, the releaser, that kind of stuff. I've seen over $20 a tap. In challenging situations or in situations where people are really building for the future and they're going to add on later, you might see these higher costs. Most of the sales data I have indicate between $0 and $12 per tap. It's variable and it's not real consistent, but it is there. We do see that pipeline does have some real market value. The problem with pipeline from a banking perspective is that it's not great collateral. Lenders typically don't want to take pipeline as collateral because it's really difficult to collect. It's plastic hung from trees in the woods. Equipment valuation. So we're going to look at the same way we're looking at real estate. We're going to look at the three recognized methods for valuing assets. We've got a cost analysis, cost new minus market derived depreciation, and we're going to get that from maple sale, lock, stock, and barrel maple operation sales, or from market-based equipment sales. And we can estimate depreciation rates based on in-depth sale analysis. Sales comparison analysis is a very similar methodology. We're going to base it on market sales of similar equipment. The issue with valuing equipment is that the sales information is limited because there really are not many ways to find out about these sales. Most of them are private or dealer related sales. Income approach is not applicable in this situation. Sugar house valuation, it's kind of the same thing. Cost minus market derived depreciation. We're going to measure that for maple sales and estimate depreciation rates based on the sales. So cost is generally in the $30 to $50 a square foot range without the land value or the equipment value included. And the values are generally in the $10 to $30 a square foot range, exclusive of land or equipment value. The issue is, again, there's few sales of modern sugar houses, reducing the reliability for modern structures. Folks that are building brand new sugar houses and spending that kind of money of $30 to $50 a square foot are not doing it to try to resell it to someone else. They're doing it to run their maple operation. So it's rare that we have a sale of that scale and that's new enough to use in this analysis. I do use an income approach sometimes to value sugar houses. And we have enough rentals in the marketplace that you can come to a rental rate that's fairly reliable and apply a cap or discount rate. Again, there are not enough rentals to really feel solid about it, but it does provide some indication. So I want to touch on assets that are located on leased land. We see most often pipeline on leased land, but I was speaking to another appraiser this morning who works in northern Maine and does a fair number of these maple operations that are entirely on leased land, sugar house, pipeline, all of it. And we can prove that there is value in a private sale entirely on leased land. The lease needs to be assignable to a new owner, and the buyer needs to perceive some low risk, meaning that the landowner needs to be willing to play ball, basically. Can you assign this lease to a bank or to a new owner? Does it need owner consent? Does it not need owner consent? These are really factors that have a big impact on the value of these assets on leased land. Insecure land ownership obviously poses risk to the buyer that the lease term won't be completed. So we're looking for longer term leases to try to bring value to the table here. Some are as long as 18 to 20 years, although what we see locally is most are in the 10-year range. One thing to consider is who gets to remove the pipeline at the end of the lease. This can be a real cost that needs to be considered on purchase. And again, it's likely not the best collateral. It's really difficult to collect the full value of assets on leased land in the event of a default. So it may be discounted significantly by lenders. So to touch on these financing considerations, we've got about 15 minutes left before 8 o'clock, and I want to leave enough room for some questions at the end. But I want to touch on some considerations for financing. Land generally holds value. Look at the long-term uses of the property. Consider all alternative uses of the property and how that might impact the long-term utility. If for some reason the maple became non-viable on that particular parcel, what else could this parcel be used for? I think that hedges risk. Changes in industry conditions or general economic conditions might impact specialized real estate more than real estate with multiple alternative uses. Buildings generally depreciate over time. Single-purpose, unique buildings can depreciate faster or experience larger losses in market value as industry conditions or best practices change over time. Equipment. Market depreciation can vary significantly with industry conditions and changes in technology. There are industries I work in now that I currently work in that we see lost capital in excess of 40%. So you drive the last nail in the barn and it's worth 40% less than what it costs you to build it. The maple industry right now is well below this level, 10, 20%. This could change over time though as things evolve. Collateral value generally shouldn't include the installation cost. This portion of the cost is generally not recoverable because you're taking the equipment back out in the event of a default. Other types of value might include the installation cost. So we talked about going concern value. These are lock, stock, and barrel sales or analysis of the sale of a business, and you would include the installation costs in that analysis. Book value might include these costs as well. One thing to remember is that some equipment might have a limited market and market value might be significantly different than cost new. I'm thinking very large equipment. You might only have 10 producers in the whole United States that are using some of this very, very large new equipment. How is that going to impact the value if you had to sell this? Again, on pipeline, what I see is that lenders often aren't counting it in the collateral value, but they're including it in the balance sheet calculations to calculate the net worth. I can prove that if this is a hard asset with real market value and under the right conditions, it can bring real value to the table. The issue is it's very hard to collect in the event of a default. What I've been doing is excluding it from the real estate value, but including it in the equipment valuation so that the lender can depreciate at about $1.50 a year so that they hit that bottomed out value over a 10-year period. So if you were at 15 bucks a tap, cost new, and you took $1.50 a year, it might not be perfect, but it'll be fairly close. So the issue with pipeline for maple producers is it's a real significant cost. It costs a lot of money to build this stuff out. And it's critical to have high quality pipeline that does what it's supposed to do to run a profitable operation at larger scale. You can't do without it at a larger scale. But it's not easy to finance. So what I generally tell people is save your cash to install pipeline. Some final thoughts. Market value is most commonly used for financing acquisition analysis. These other types of value are completely valid. They're useful in specific situations, but should not be confused with market value. Profitability in the maple industry is driven investment. The maple industry has become more bankable in the past decade. There's a lot more capital going into the industry, and market-based asset valuation should drive investment decision-making. And finally, maple operations must invest significant capital into pipeline systems in order to operate efficiently and profitably. these make poor collateral for financing and should be given special consideration in business planning. And folks should really be thinking about, how are we going to build additional pipeline given the constraints of financing new pipeline? So with that, I'll wrap up, and thanks for your attention. And I hope there's some additional questions. I have a few more here that were given at sign up, but I want to make sure that I open up the floor. We've got about 10 minutes before 8.
Great, Rob. Thanks for that. Take a couple seconds, catch your breath. I'm going to certainly invite people to, add in questions over the chat box. And I also am going to give people the option to unmute yourself if you'd like to speak. I would just ask that if you're going to speak, unmute yourself, and then be sure to mute yourself again after, because it does help to cut the background noise down. So that is an option, and we'll give people a couple of seconds to type in. There was one question that came in earlier, Rob. I know you did touch on leased land at the end, but the one question was, is there discussion on leased fee or leaseholds? I'm not actually quite familiar with all of that language, so is there anything you could expand a little bit on as far as leased land or what they might be looking for?
Yeah, I guess I can touch on that a little bit. To understand the value of a leased fee position, generally, we're going to assign a market value and then adjust that somewhat for a leased fee position. What we see more often is a leasehold position. Let's say you have an assignable lease that is at 50 cents a tap. The local market's at $1 a tap. You could make 50 cents a tap assigning that lease to someone else. Realizing that value gets pretty tricky because it requires you selling your leasehold position to someone else, and that transfer isn't always clean. I deal with it a whole lot less, but it's possible that there could be value there. Whoops.
Rob, we got another one in the chat here.
Sure.
Are wind, recreational, or hunting leases somewhat common on sugar bushes? Do you have experience seeing these?
On very large, sort of industrial timberland parcels that have been converted to sugar bush, we do see some of this. And I actually have some sales of leases, not the wind tower itself, but the lease. So there you go. That speaks to the other question as well. So you'd be selling your right to receive the lease income, and we are seeing that on some of the large industrial timber parcels that have been converted to maple. It's not real common. But I think maybe as the industry continues to develop and continues to mature, folks might be looking for other income streams. And I think that's a viable option, especially the recreational leases or the hunting leases. In other parts of the country, they bring real value. Here, we just don't see it as much.
Okay, we've got another one coming in here. Obviously, many factors go into an appraisal, but have you found a rule of thumb per tap value for average or an above average woodland? I've heard between $20 and $30 per tap. Your thoughts?
I think that's not a bad range. The data is variable because when you're looking at alternative uses of the property as well as maple, it can start to skew those numbers. So I've got sales as low as $15 a tap, and I've got sales as high as $50 a tap. And most often there's something else going in there. On the low end of the range, we're going to see sort of less accessible parcels that really don't have other alternative uses. You need to realize that there's something else in those numbers beyond just the maple trees. So you've got your base land value that might very well have other interesting might well have other value beyond the value of the maple itself. So I think of it as kind of layering, but it's all wrapped into that per tap. So on the high end at $50 a tap, you know, there's probably other things that this property can be used for, and the maple is a component of that. But I think 20 to 30, 35 is the bulk of the data. So speaking on a per tap basis, I just pulled up some of the work that we were doing on the investment profiles, because one of the questions we had in sign up was, what are the latest costs for commercial taps, lines, site work, equipment for a 25,000 tap maple operation? We've analyzed some different scales, and I'll put out some preliminary numbers tonight. And these numbers are just for the equipment. They don't include the land value. They would include all the processing equipment, the pipeline, the sugar house, the RO, the evaporator. So everything basically except the real estate. And at a larger scale, let's say 20,000 plus taps, we're somewhere in that $30 a tap range. When you get smaller, the cost per tap starts to rise. Looking at something around 10,000 taps, we might be around $35 a tap. The smaller scale 5,000 tap operations, we might be around $40 a tap. I'm using nice round numbers here, but I think it approximates investment levels that are pretty realistic. So if you add those into the land value, you're looking at investment levels of $50 to $70 a tap, lock, stock, and barrel. And that is a lot of what, you know, kind of what we're seeing in the market right now. Now, this is assuming all new equipment. That'd be the other thing to bring up. The other interesting question I've got here is there a difference between organic and conventional sugarbush other than on the processing side? I assume they're talking about value. I have not seen that in the data yet. The barrier to entry to go from a conventional sugarbush to an organic sugarbush is fairly low, assuming that you're following the tapping guidelines and you're not tapping a lot of small trees or practicing poor forest management. The barrier to entry to become an organic maple producer is not real high. It's not like dairy where you have a 3-year transition period. So we're not really seeing that difference in value. I think folks are buying non-organic land and certifying it fairly quickly. It's not typical that folks are putting commercial fertilizer out in their forest. So there aren't a whole lot of pitfalls there. So we're not seeing that in the data. It might develop over time as the markets mature, but we're not seeing it now.
Rob, I'm going to throw a question in myself. You did speak quite a bit about collateral value of pipeline and some of the challenges there. I'm wondering, you work in other agricultural sectors. There's certainly other investments on farms that have kind of a high rate of obsolescence, certain specialized buildings and other kind of investments. You know, I just kind of say, well, so other investments. So do you have any experience, like, could you share, I know there's capital providers on the call here. Is some of this just new because it's maple? I mean, are there other industries that have found ways to collateralize business investments that often don't really have a portable value, let's say? Other things you may see on dairy farms or poultry facilities that the lending community has found ways to collateralize that?
Yeah.
Or not.
Or not collateralize it and do an unsecured line of credit. Generally, you're going to pay a little more for your credit when it's unsecured or has poor collateral value. But there certainly are lenders who will loan against assets that are not recoverable. A lot of times what we'll see is other assets will be put up to provide collateral for the loan. in the instance where you can't collateralize what you're actually buying. So let's say you might be putting up your house, which is a kind of a scary thing for some folks. But the reality is that collection of pipeline is really difficult. And so, the lenders, I think rightfully, don't necessarily want to use it it can have serious value. You're talking $10 a tap on 20,000 taps. That's a lot of money. But to then go and try to recover that in a default situation, I think is unrealistic. So what we see is that you might get an unsecured line of credit. You might work out a lease situation, which generally has a fairly high imputed interest rate, but there are lease providers out there that will finance pipeline. Generally, you're going to pay like 8 to 11% interest on those things, but it can be done. And a lot of times what I see is that the equity that folks are building in their real estate is then leveraged against new pipeline. So if you're going to build out new pipeline on a leased operation, you might reappraise your home farm to use that equity to move it into the new place. And that may not be a bad investment. We've talked about other times about the ability to grow without having to buy more land. That can really increase your return on investment overall for your operation. But you need to be aware of the limitations of the financing community when it comes to rapid growth without the collateral to go with it.
Great. So we're right at 8:01. I'll check to see if there's anything else in the chat box. And certainly if anyone needs to get off right away, don't hesitate. Glad to have you. But, well, that's a great question. Rob, since you're the speaker, crystal ball, do you see continued growth in Sugarbush and sap houses? You're out there in the field. I know you're doing deals. You're appraising potential deals. Can you give us a sense of the marketplace right now and what you're seeing happening?
I still see a lot of building. Even as the bulk price has settled out, I think a lot of the large producers have gotten a lot of equity over the past 10 years. There's still very, very strong demand for maple syrup out there at the bulk level. Retail markets are pretty hot, and the big packers are expanding. They're putting more syrup through their facilities. If you track the bulk price against the Canadian bulk price times the exchange rate, we're pretty much in equilibrium there. So changes in the exchange rate are really driving a lot of the changes in our bulk price, and I think that producers are still pretty bullish and expanding. I haven't seen anybody taking anything off their sugar house, but I'm appraising a lot of sugar houses getting bigger.
Hey Rob, this is Mark Isselhart. Thanks for a great presentation. That was really excellent. We've definitely heard a lot about COVID refugees and folks moving away from the cities, at least buying property, maybe not moving. Have you seen any impact on the value of land that could also be Sugarbush as a result of this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. We have seen in areas of Vermont, especially, we've seen values going up, especially in these under 200 acre parcels. If there is power and fiber internet at the road, they sell very, very quickly. I'm actually starting to analyze what's the speed of internet available at the road when I'm looking at rural parcels as one of the factors that I'm considering in the valuation. And Vermont has a great interactive map that you can look that up. And when I talk to the realtors, they're telling me this is the most traffic they've seen in 30 years, some of them. Central, southern Vermont, especially. The more rural areas in the northeast corner, less so. But yeah, certainly maple parcels are not immune to that. Some of these, but I see it as also an opportunity for sugar makers. Some of these folks aren't really sure what to do with the property beyond that they want to have a place to go to get out of the city. And maple has a great reputation. And I think that, the opportunity to go lease some of these properties that are changing hands might be an opportunity for some maple producers.